Do you want me to start? Sorry about that.
Oh, sorry, Harvey, I'll start and then I'll lead you in. All right?
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Nicole Mittman and I'm the Chief Scientist and Vice President of Evidence Standards here at CADTH. As a moderator for today's webinar, I wanted to first introduce myself. I'm a non-Indigenous settler who arrived in Canada in the early 1970s from Australia with parents who came from Germany, and my ancestry is German. I'm joining you today, and I'm currently located between Peterborough and Bancroft in Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas and the Assiniboine. I recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place, and I want to thank many of the generations of people who have been stewards of this land from the beginning. So welcome to CADTH's special webinar dedicated to marking Canada's inaugural National Day for Truth and Reconciliation coming up on September 30th. There are 94 calls to actions from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of which, number 80, requests commemoration and calls on the federal government in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples to establish a statutory holiday, a national day for truth and reconciliation, to honor survivors, their families, and communities, and ensure that public commemoration of the history and the legacy of residential schools remains a vital component to the reconciliation process. So let's focus on today's webinar. Today, we're truly honored to be joined by a prestigious group of presenters who are leaders in healthcare, research, academia, and Indigenous realms. Dr. Carrie Bourassa from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Dr. Alexandra King from the University of Saskatchewan, and Dr. Alika Lafontaine, President-elect of the Canadian Medical Association. We'll have an opportunity to hear from our Indigenous leaders as they reflect and contemplate on the challenges and opportunities of implementing the truth and reconciliation calls to action in connection with healthcare and the work we do to support our healthcare system. With them, we'll commemorate the tragic history of the residential schools and explore paths to healing. So let's talk about our webinar format. Using a fireside chat format, each of our speakers will introduce themselves, and then I will begin a discussion with our guests about challenges and opportunities of implementing the truth and reconciliation calls to action. Before we begin, Elder Harvey Thunderchild has kindly offered to introduce himself and lead us through an opening prayer. Welcome, Elder Harvey Thunderchild. Please lead us in an opening prayer.
Thank you. Just to clarify on the introduction page that you had on there, I'm not the band manager of Sunchild. I work with the Indigenous Health and Wellness at College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. On the front, you had band manager of Sunchild First Nations. Just to clarify that, so. You can join me by praying the way you know how. And it's, I appreciate and thank the organization for inviting me to do this, to participate in this way. Ancho makuti magkwesino tinagato yisini ovaksna machi kipo na maxon. Tamatan mawita mansi kasanto tawya. Awisi na nanto isis kaskita ismusita kiwan isatus kakaman. Ang station the tamatama mawita imang bika cheka kinos katwa. Maga imans kaskita piapsko no kapasita. Mamu utama makita na nista no tayo taske dehi oge tasko waya pues kuisi so magita makota busko kuito to bista aga taske ega nista na pastaje to sis ago mesin tamatan tayo makita ya magnang na nista na conseguido pago fue taske de besin Ewan ministers ibig sama ko yang gusto tamaan kin. Tuwa mo ito na. Kaya kami gusto tamaan. Exam. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Harvey, for your prayer. Next, I'd like to turn things over to our panel, who will begin introducing themselves in the following order. Welcome, Dr. Carrie Bourassa, Dr. Alexandra King, and Dr. Alika Lafontaine. Carrie, over to you for the introduction.
Ani Miigwech. I'm Carrie Bourassa. I grew up in Treaty 4 territory. I grew up with my grandfather. I am Métis. I am from the firm local number 33, and I'm honored to be here today. I grew up in Treaty 4 territory in Regina, right across from Scott Collegiate. However, I have been warmly welcomed into Treaty 6 territory, where I live and work at the University of Saskatchewan. I do have a tenured faculty position in the College of Medicine. And so I'm honored to be here with some of these pretty amazing colleagues and faculty members here today. So miigwech.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to start by thanking Harvey for his wonderful words and blessing us with the Cree language. It really is important when we're going into, I think, what could be very difficult conversations. And so thank you, Harvey. So my name is Alexandra King, or at least that's my government name. My spirit name is Papachini, which means moving otter. And I've been gifted with a second one by elders in my own nation, which is Nandwiwewen Nizaya, which is the healer with the brave heart, standing strong for our people. I'm a member of Nipissing First Nation, and all of my Indigenous ancestry comes on my mother's side, a combination of Anishinaabe, Algonquin, and Mohawk. And then my dad was mixed European. I have trained as an internist, and also I'm doing health research at the University of Saskatchewan as the inaugural CAMI co-chair in Indigenous Health and Wellness. Thank you.
I'm Alika Lafontaine. I'm happy to join from Treaty 8, where I live on and work on the traditional territory of the Woodlands, Cree, Dene, and Métis homelands. I'm originally from Treaty 4. My father's Métis, Anishinaabe, and Plains Cree, and my mom's a Pacific Islander. Thanks to Harvey for grounding us, and really looking forward to connecting with all of the participants here today for this really important conversation.
Thank you all. And so before I begin my first question, I wanted to just remind the audience that throughout this question and answer session and webinar, you can also submit your questions at any time by clicking on the question and answer tab in the Zoom control bar. Please let me know if you want to direct your questions to a specific person. So we've had a pre-conversation about some of the questions that we wanted to ask. And maybe, Alexandra, if I can turn to you for our first question. Thinking about your unique perspective and experiences, could you talk about where you've seen successes in incorporating the TRC calls to action in our healthcare system?
Sure. I think that there has been some progress, a growing awareness amongst non-Indigenous health professionals on historic trauma and its effects on the health and wellness of Indigenous peoples in Canada. I guess the flip side is that there is a long way to go. For me, it's much like we've set off on a trip and someone keeps on asking, are we there yet? And in fact, the journey has just begun. I think we're seeing some really great progress in supporting this growing awareness. As a medical student, I was involved in a joint undertaking that was by the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada and the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada to develop an Indigenous health curriculum framework for undergrad med ed. So this is essentially to provide cultural competency training to our medical students across Canada. Since then, we've sort of shifted from cultural competency to more of a cultural safety approach. And this is a framework in which the gaze really is as much on the practitioner and the system as it is on the patient, and which really recognizes inherent power imbalances and inequities in our healthcare system. So we are seeing a great variety of training resources that are developing or have been developed, such as the SANIUS Indigenous Cultural Safety Training. However, again, a lot of the problem is that it's the focus is on an individual practitioner rather than the healthcare system overall, and recognizing the healthcare system as a determinant that perpetuates inequities. I think also of the calls to action, and they talk about the need for Indigenous wellness system. And so when we're thinking about reconciliation, that whole area really needs much greater support and recognition from the mainstream healthcare, I think.
Thanks very much, Alexandra. Carrie or Alika, any other comments and thoughts on potential successes in the healthcare system?
Want to go first, Carrie?
I was waiting for you. I guess I could say some of the strengths in the healthcare system now, I think, are that we are seeing some innovation, and some of the innovation now, I think, is that we're seeing elders and healers coming into the system, and that's making, I think, a big difference. And I want to apologize and thank Elder Harvey for the prayer, but it's more than just bringing elders in for prayer now, as we know, right? Elders are really making a huge difference, I think, in the healthcare system, whether it's coming in as mentors or leading research or leading some of the curriculum development. And I know, Alika, that you will, I know, maybe I think that you will agree with me that when we were at the Royal College together, that we really did make a lot of difference with when Dr. Tom was there. And we saw him as an elder, and he really did create space, I think, to have elders and knowledge keepers, because we always say that, elders and knowledge keepers are our PhDs, right? And so I think that now we're seeing more and more of this, and it is really, really changing the face of healthcare, and we need that. So I think that we could certainly talk more about this and how it is changing the face of healthcare in many different ways and in different areas. But I see that as something that is happening. And one really short example, and I'm going to turn it over to Alika, is that we're creating an elder in residence program at CHR. Could you ever imagine that would happen, 5-10 years ago? So I'll leave it there, and Alika, see what you have to say.
Yeah, and just to carry it on from where Alex and Carrie left it, I do a lot of work in innovation, obviously, and with the Canadian Medical Association, we're starting to see that, we start off, I think, in the truth phase of Truth and Reconciliation, talking a lot about ideology and philosophy, creating space and starting to accept that things that Indigenous peoples have lived through, things like racism, oppression, disempowerment, disenfranchisement from the health system. These aren't realities that just started at the beginning of the TRC, tribunals and those gatherings. It really started, years ago, ever since, we were born, and these are the societies that we're kind of brought into. So creating that space and ensuring that that's accepted as truth is something that we've obviously moved towards. But there eventually has to be a shift from ideology towards, the practical logistics of how we literally do this. And I think that's what you're starting to see now. And what I'm really hearing from, fellow colleagues like Carrie and Alex, who, do both clinical advocacy and, research, is that it's not enough just to bear witness now. Like, we actually have to do something. Right. And I think that's an accountability part that's starting to grow. And I'm really encouraged by the willingness of people to accept that that's kind of where we're at. At the very beginning of talking about, residential schools and, the 60s scoop and, all these things that suddenly came into the Canadian consciousness, almost a decade and a bit ago, we're now at a place where people accept that that's just the lived reality of Canada. And that now that we have borne witness, now what are we going to do as a result of what we know? And I think that that's the part and place that we're at right now.
Great. Yeah.
Thanks very much for those responses. And maybe Alika, if I can ask you, sort of carrying on with the same theme, where have we fallen short in the rhetoric versus the reality? Examples of organizations putting responses to the TRC on paper, but then where actions don't seem to follow.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to actioning the things that we can do versus asking the other side, the people who actually experience the struggle, to carry the burden of change. It's been pretty common in a lot of the areas that I work in to have those who hold power, resources like money or people or information, etc., to sit back and say, well, you tell us what to do. We'll wait until we fully understand, and then we might consider doing something. And there's different ways that we talk about that. But I think that whole saying of nothing for us without us has to some degree been reframed as we won't do anything until you tell us what to do. And I think of my own clinical practice, as an anesthesiologist. I mean, you'd never expect to come into surgery and tell your doctor what drugs to use, right? You tell them kind of the goals that you were working for, the things that you were concerned about, but you'd expect me to have some strategies on what to actually do, right? And I think that that's really the call to action, and the challenge for all of us is when you look at the TRC calls to action in health in particular, these are pretty broad topics, but the knowledge of what to do doesn't just lie with the persons who are experiencing the suffering. It also lies with the people who actually work in these systems day to day. And I think where we've really fallen short is people realizing that they really have the power to do something, and I'm really hoping that, webinars like this and continuous call to action from, everyone who's on the panel moves us towards really thinking about what can we do and actually just start doing it.
Thanks very much, Alika. Alexandra or Carrie, any additional thoughts?
I think we're looking at each other to see who's going to go. I think Alika has really framed that well, and certainly describes a lot of the sentiments expressed to me by colleagues. I really think of Senator Murray Sinclair, who is the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's quote, where he talks about how we have described for you a mountain, we have shown you the path to the top, we call on you to do the climbing. And this is something that we all have to get in and be doing and stepping up, I think.
Carrie, any further thoughts there?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree, and we can, I certainly have some suggestions, but I'm not sure if we want to wait until some of the other questions pop up. But I completely agree with Alex. It's we can't sort of sit on our hands, and at the same time, I also think that we have to make sure that we're serving communities, and that we're not sort of taking things over. I think there's a reciprocity that has to take place.
Nicole, I'll just kind of jump in just to follow up on that. There was a question in the Q&A about the responding to calls to action, particularly 22. And if you look at 22, it talks about the role of traditional healing practices in kind of the course of medical care. So I remember a conversation that I had with a oncology colleague, and they were expressing frustration that a patient of theirs was using traditional medicines, but they wouldn't tell them what was in the medicine. And so we ended up having a long conversation, and at the end of it, they asked me, well, what should I do? And I said, well, have you ever thought of just giving them the medical information of your medications and then having them give it to the elder, and then they can get back to you about, what they think the interactions might be.
Mhm.
And I think there's sometimes an assumption that Indigenous peoples are waiting for us to kind of solve some of these things. The reality is traditional medicine will continue on whether it has the consent of mainstream medicine or not. Even when ceremonial practices in traditional medicine were outlawed under Canadian law, at risk of being put in jail and fined, these practices continued. And I think stepping back and looking at how we can create space, how we can bring validity into our own world for these different calls to action, versus thinking that somehow we act as gatekeepers for these things moving along, when really we're enablers, and we remove ourselves to get out of the way. I think is one of the things that I really encourage colleagues and researchers and everyone else who participates in making sure our healthcare system functions, to start to frame some of these calls to action, because you can do stuff right now to do things. You don't have to wait for a program or government funding envelope to actually move forward with some of these things.
Sorry, Nicole, if I could leap
Yeah.
in based on what I think this is supposed to be fireside, so chatting, and so hopefully we are doing that. As I was listening to Alika, I think that he's highlighting two components to things. And one is this notion of gatekeeping. And in fact, many Indigenous people are making use of traditional medicines and approaches, whether or not they're telling the healthcare professionals. So, I think it's something that is important to recognize that if they are opening up about it, there is a level of trust that is being shown, and really how to be building upon that. The second thing is the need to reconceptualize how we're understanding medicines. I think from a Western perspective, we're thinking of drugs and, what are the components within, and are there interactions and so on. From an Indigenous perspective, we think much more of the spirit and how it heals, and the spiritual components of things. And so a lot of the practices that we have definitely may involve plants, and the plants may have actual therapeutic value, but a lot of it is also the practice and the approach to it. And that is something then that I think we need to be looking at. We've all thanked Harvey this morning for his prayer. Prayers are important. Indigenous language is medicine, our music, our songs, our dance. So I think really trying to shift an understanding of what is medicine is an important component as well.
Mhm.
Well, and I think you've, oh, sorry, Carrie, if you wanted to continue.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I think particularly now, we've been doing a lot of work at the direction of some of the communities the communities that we serve, and in right now in COVID, where there's vaccine in particular, we're getting a lot of direction around how important it is, to be able to use medicines, and to be foraging for particular medicines that will enhance vaccine uptake. And so I think this conversation is actually, very timely and very important. And again, that, there are, medicine people, and, they're very particular about how those medicines are going to be used. We do a lot of knowledge mobilization, so they're leading all of that. And so I think, and I'm sure that, all my colleagues are going to have very similar discussions, or they'll be, thinking about this in a different way. But, just to say that this is happening, as Alika said, and as Alex said, this is happening, and it is being led by the communities, and by the medicine people, and the healers, and the elders, that that they have that knowledge, right? So it's a very important discussion to have, and I'm just going to sort of leave it there. But this is happening, right? And it's valuable, but also there's no sort of line by line, this is how it goes, right? And so again, these are held by those medicine people and elders and knowledge keepers.
Thanks, Carrie. I think you've almost led us into the next question, but I see Harvey's hand is up, so I wanted to give him an opportunity as well.
Thank you, Nicole. And I welcome everybody else that are listening in and tuning in, and a chance to hear all the panelists that are talking. But just to summarize of what Alika and Dr. King were saying about traditional people, you know, in day and age today, the institutions like hospitals and everything, there's healthcare services, traditional services that are available to First Nations people using medicines or bringing medicines in. I think we as Indian people, a lot of times we resort to our sweat lodge makers to bring in our cloths, and anything that ail us, we take it into the sweat lodge and get the medicine man, whoever's doing the lodge, we give them the prints to pray on behalf of the family, the sicknesses that they're facing right now. I know with institutions and different hospitals across Canada, they have cultural services, but sometimes I think, you know, you have to have people that have good knowledge about traditional practices and traditional health. And I think of, you know, institutions have to understand our practices. You know, sometimes there's less patience of what we do as Indigenous people. We're trying to help people with that. I'm only giving you an example of I had a family member at the University of Saskatchewan. I did my part to help him in the traditional way, you know, of praying for him and doing certain rituals to make him feel a lot better. And I think if we believe our ways, we believe in the systems that we use, as long as we believe in those and have faith in those will work. And that's something that we need to work on more, I guess, as institutions and healthcare institutions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Harvey. I think that really leads us into the next question, is thinking about recognizing the value and the impact of Indigenous knowledge. How can an evidence-based organization like CADTH incorporate this knowledge in a meaningful way so that decision makers are really best prepared to serve all populations with recommendations that incorporate Indigenous knowledge? And I see that those are the questions in some of the question and answer chat box as well. Maybe Carrie, can I ask you to start us out?
Sure. So I don't know if I'm I don't know if I'm the right person for this question, but you know, I think, you know, some of the changes I can say some of the changes that we're trying to undertake, at least at CHR, is really at the direction of the communities. We started when I became the scientific director originally. We started by undertaking a strategic plan for IAPH. That strategic plan then was embedded within CHR as a whole. And so I think at the core, and I think this is completely in alignment with the TRC, is self-determination. You know, communities, that was the number one priority for them, was self-determination. And so some of the things that we've been working on, and which will be announced in the fall here, which we're pretty much in the middle of fall, so very soon we'll be able to announce these changes that really came from Indigenous communities. Is that, you know, in order to be, you know, self-determining, communities want to be able to hold and administer their own funds. We need to be removing barriers so that, you know, along with that, indirect costs, you know, need to be allotted to those communities who want to hold and administer those funds. That's a bit of a catch-22 for CHR, because we have to, you know, open up the CHR Act, which is very difficult, but we're having a workaround. We have a reference committee, which is trying to address, you know, many of these other barriers. There's a new CV application, so that you know, communities do not have to go through that big process that other CHR applicants have to. It's a 3-page Word document that is tailored to communities, and elders and knowledge keepers can also be an NPI or a co-PI if they wish. So lots of changes are happening. We also, of course, have iterative peer review. We have elders on regular peer review panels. So there's a lot of changes that are happening, and this is all leading to support what the strategic plan has put before them, which came from Indigenous communities. So I think, you know, this is really shifting, and also including policy changes to ensure that elders will be on policy issues. They will be guiding policy issues, and they will be paid accordingly, so that they have a living wage if they're doing any work for CHR. So having, again, going back to elders and knowledge keepers, ensuring that elders are not only on Institute advisory boards, but throughout CHR, guiding throughout CHR. And I don't think we could ever have, again, thought about that way back in the day for most of us when we were hoping that these kinds of changes would happen. And this is not a pat on the back by any means, but to see this kind of shift and this kind of alignment with the TRC is important. And there's much more, of course, that needs to happen. This is just a beginning. So I'll leave it there, but I think that this is vitally important, an important start. And we're certainly looking for more feedback and direction from the academia and from communities.
Thanks very much, Carrie. You've talked about the academic initiatives. Perhaps I can ask Alexandra or Alika, you know, thinking about our evidence-based organization, which is CADTH, and how do we incorporate this in our daily work?
Well, I guess I can go next, and then Alika will be able to finish things off nicely. So I'm not sure if Alika or Carrie are aware, but I'm co-chairing CADTH, has created an advisory panel to develop a framework for pan-Canadian prescription drug list. And so this is essentially the beginning of a move towards universal pharmacare. And so I would say that in some ways, CADTH has already started on this journey. They've brought in an Indigenous person, and in fact, there's also Dr. Nell Wyman, who is the president of IPAC, the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada, who's part of this advisory panel. So we have more than one Indigenous voice, one in a leadership position on this panel. And I would suggest that the panel overall, as well as the CADTH staff, have been really good at embracing suggestions as I've been putting them forward. So as an example, for each of our advisory panels, we're starting off with acknowledgement of territory, but importantly, I think it is that each of the panel members have stepped up and are doing research into their own territorial acknowledgement and presenting that. So as a group, we're all learning together. The area that I think really is something that we have yet to tap into and requires consideration, and it's going to be a journey, is when we consider evidence that typically informs CADTH decisions. And it's here that you really are seeing sort of the tyranny of Western science, if you will, and not even, many of us don't even appreciate the inherent biases in what we're calling evidence. And so there has been a wedge that has opened this up, and that is what's become known as real world evidence. And I think that that may be a way that we can be incorporating Indigenous philosophies, ways of knowing, being, and doing, so that we can understand that the typical evidence base that informs, let's say, health technology assessments and other things is insufficient. It's insufficient for all people, but especially for Indigenous people. And so I don't know that we're going to get it right the first pass, but I do think that we have started on this journey, and these are really important steps. Alika?
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. And, you know, talking about evidence-based medicine and best practices, it was informative in my anesthesia training when I had a professor sit down with me and ask me the question, what's the most powerful study, when you do the mathematics? And the most powered study is actually an N of 1. It's the person who's right in front of you. So you can do a lot of research and, be aware of best practices, but if it's not working for the people that you're trying to serve, you really should try something else, and, there's always the question of, what do you do and how do you know that it works? How do you know that things are changing? I think what I hear from both Carrie and Alex is that there's, a space being made for, Indigenous peoples and Indigenous advocates to start to shape what is true. Like, how do we actually evaluate whether or not, things are valid and we should reallocate resources? And then there's the actual reallocation of resources. And that's truly where system change happens, and one of the points that I always try and come back to whenever talking about system transformation is that there's often this belief that Indigenous health is really different from what we do in mainstream health. The reality is although the philosophies and practices may differ in the way that they share certain concepts, the core things that come down to the, provider-patient relationship, things like clear communication, trust, making sure that autonomy is respected, having an integration between the mind, body, and heart. All of these things are actually shared positives across the system. And in the same way, the negatives that are experienced within Indigenous health are in some ways just a magnification of what exists in other places. When we talk about patient-centered care, it's really this concept that the patient voice has no place at the table when it comes to decision-making. A patient doesn't have freedom of choice when it comes to different options, that patients don't have information freely shared so they can make informed decisions about their own care. Magnify that by 10, 20, 100 times. That's what Indigenous peoples experience day after day. And so I think what works at CADTH and what works elsewhere in the system really comes back to those same core things that we know work when we apply other things that have been successful: patient safety, quality improvement, patient safety, and then giving the space for people to redefine what things mean in their own languages and their own traditions and their own local philosophies, I think is what really leads to the social change. There's always a mix of, how people think and how people act, and you need both things to change in order to have, sustained system change. And I think the things that have been shared by Carrie and Alex and, the comments from Elder Harvey are all moving us towards kind of that end state where, we really have reconciliation, a change in both our minds, our hearts, and the way we act.
Thank you for that, all those thoughts. And I wonder, for people and organizations that are unsure where to begin when it comes to engaging with Indigenous communities or Indigenous leaders, what advice do you have, all of you perhaps, to build or initiate on collaborative relationships with Indigenous governments or communities or organizations or groups? Can I throw it out there?
Yeah, I'll maybe jump in first. What I always recommend to organizations is step back and figure out the things that you want to do, whether or not they're called different things within Indigenous communities. We talk about protocols, for example. What protocols are a series of steps and rules that govern relationships, that govern that value exchange that happens between, one person and someone else. And I think when people understand that that's what protocol means, it suddenly becomes a lot clearer to them that, oh, well, this is really governing the way that our relationship works. That's something that they can wrap their head around. And so I encourage organizations that are at the very first step to look at the way that they do things and then compare that against the way that community does things and see whether or not the same things are done, just called different things. The second part of it is to reach out to, someone who can help guide you along. So we often see these advisory committees set up with different organizations, or they bring in, consultants. Really evaluate who you bring onto these committees based on their success within Indigenous communities. it's interesting when we talk about traditional medicine versus mainstream medicine, because traditional practitioners, their validity within community really comes down to whether or not what they do works. You know, it's an interesting structure when you compare it against mainstream medicine, which evaluates whether or not someone's good at their job based on their certifications. So whether or not I'm a good anesthesiologist has less to do with how you experience anesthesia and more to do that I'm a fellow of the Royal College. You know, and I think when you're evaluating persons to guide you along the journey of reconciliation, really taking that traditional approach where you're looking at individuals that you bring on, whether or not they actually have impact, whether or not they're helping you along your journey, whether or not, you know, communities that you're hoping to engage with are actually engaging with you. I think that that's probably a better measure than, you know, someone who has a list of certifications and courses that they've taken.
If I may for a minute, Nicole.
Yes, of course.
I think, you know, this is a very interesting, I've always had this keen interest of doing any type of traditional assistance with the people that are encountering illnesses. And I think of Alexandra, I remember we talked about this a few months back, maybe a year ago, of how Anishinaabe Health Center in Toronto area, where they work with doctors and the traditional people. And there's, I worked in the Sioux Tribe of Chippewa Indians back in the early 90s in Michigan for a number of years. Now, the being a part of an institution, the health center, and within the tribe that I worked with, I worked as the emergency management employee assistance coordinator. Now, in coordinating what's going to best work, traditional practice opposed to Western medicine and traditional medicine. I remember the old fellow that I worked with, who was my mentor at that time, was Adam Lucia, has since passed on. But his workers, the people that he worked with, that he taught, continue to do the work. What we ended up doing was we worked with the tribe, the tribal chief, and the health center, everybody else involved. They created a lodge where they work with a traditional healer alongside the clinic. Now they can see the doctor over here, and if they choose to do so, go see the traditional healer. And then what they'll do is as long as you bring cloth, then they'll have the ceremonies there, and then he or she will provide the medicine that they think is going to help them. And I still think that this is something that we need to work on in Canada or in Saskatchewan. And I still believe, you know, right now Health Canada provides community members travel assistance to go see a healer somewhere. But before they were able to help individuals to go to province, but now they're only limiting to the borders of each province. Because word of mouth, and telegraph works really well. What traditional practice or healer does a lot of good stuff. And it shows by how people heal. And it's something that, you know, I just thought I'd share with them.
Thank you very much, Elder Harvey. I don't know if Carrie or Alexandra wanted to answer that question, but I know that we have a number of questions in the Q&A. So do you want me to turn over to some of the Q&A questions, perhaps?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I think what Elder Harvey and Alika have said are critically important. I think another thing about getting to connect with Indigenous people is doing your homework, you know, and really looking at the history of the Indigenous people in the specific area that, you know, you live, work, and play, that you're a guest on their territories, and trying to understand their history from their perspective. So when you go and meet with them, you're not sitting there saying, well, I didn't know and I had no idea and stuff. We have a responsibility, I think, to know, and it is possible to do your homework. And then when you're going in, you have a better understanding of sort of their journey so far. And also then when they're saying that this is how they want to exercise self-determination, it gives you a better context to be supporting that.
Thank you. There are a couple questions I just wanted to highlight. One is for you, Dr. King. In your opinion, what are some practical steps towards a wellness-centered healthcare system, in addition to reforming curriculum for medical students?
Well, it's interesting. There is elder scholar, lodgekeeper Willie Ermine of Sturgeon Lake First Nation, and we've had a conversation about the Indigenous wellness system versus the Western healthcare system. And we were discussing an analogy to Giswenta, or the two-row wampum belt. And for those who don't know, this is an early treaty between Europeans, in particular the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee, when the Europeans were first arriving in North America. And it basically has these two lines, one of which signifies the Indigenous journey, and then there's another one that signifies the Western journey, and that these are two separate, parallel, self-respecting systems. And so I know when I was talking with Willie, one of the things that he has mentioned is that they need resources. They need allocations to be able to be implementing wellness systems that make sense within all of the different contexts that Indigenous people find themselves. And that there would be a shift needed, because a lot of Indigenous approaches to wellness are highly preventative. And so we're doing a lot of work that is much more upstream. And how do we go about doing that, and so on. We have elders, knowledge holders, medicine people who would be able to map that journey out. But one of the things that they do need, Carrie has alluded to this, Alika has, is actual real access to resources. And that's when implementation could truly happen.
Thank you. I'm noticing that our time has just flown by, and we're almost out of time, but I did want to ask a final question to each of you. And it actually comes from one of our questions in the Q&A section. And I thought, what does CADTH need to do from a practical perspective to ensure that Indigenous and Alexandra, you mentioned sort of real world evidence, is integrated into its health technology assessment or health technology management processes? Maybe can I turn that over to each of you? There's some thoughts. Carrie, can I pick on you first?
Health technology. Well, I mean, we have been doing, in terms of at the direction. I mean, the thing is, for me, when it comes to working out of our lab at Morningstar Lodge, we don't come and sort of say, hey, we have this great idea, let's do this. The work that comes out of Morningstar Lodge comes from community. So the kind of technology that we've been working on has a lot to do with developing language apps and revitalizing Indigenous languages. And so that has been something that has been ongoing for a long time. And again, it has come from mostly First Nations communities, but also with Métis communities, revitalizing Michif languages. And I think that has been incredibly productive. It has been very important, particularly in COVID, because in COVID, the translation has been important. So we've worked to translate not only for fact sheets in paper, but also electronically. So most of the technology is not sort of high tech for what we're doing, but it is really, really important. So we've been able to partner with the Canadian Aging and Brain Health Innovation, CABI, but also we've been able to, at their direction, also work with Good Food Boxes. And it doesn't seem like it's very high tech, but it's what the communities have asked of us. So it's probably not really what you're looking for, but it's what the communities have asked us to do. So I'm just going to leave it there because probably others have much more to provide, I think.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Carrie was talking about, you know, the first statement I'll make is actually an economic one. Hire Indigenous programmers and software developers. You know, I see lots with cultural safety and cultural competency support that people often hire organizations that have, you know, a single Indigenous person who's like VP of Indigenous programming and everyone else within the organization is non-Indigenous. Hire Indigenous peoples and give them resources to solve these problems, right? So that's the first thing that I'd really underline. You have to set aside resources for, you know, actually developing communities, otherwise the development won't occur. The second part is that as you're creating the frameworks for what your tech actually does, keep in mind that, you know, the technological capacity of some of these locations geographically and even within urban centers, people sometimes don't have, you know, 5 digital devices. Sometimes they don't have the newest, you know, iPad that can run, you know, OS 15, you know, so design your programming around stuff that requires low bandwidth, that doesn't require, you know, the newest, most fancy, you know, tech. Think through how people practically access some of these resources. You know, sometimes within, you know, rural remote communities, like in the area that I work in Northern Alberta, people use the library or the school in order to access things. You know, if you're going to have, you know, a deep personal conversation about mental health, you know, the way you structure that's completely different if you're using a public computer than if you have, you know, a dedicated device with good internet, you know. So some of these practical considerations, I think those would be brought up by persons who kind of live that experience. And then the third part is when you have advisory committees where you bring elders into your work, fund them as if you're paying someone who actually contributes to, you know, things versus, you know, a low level honorarium, when really the information you're getting from those groups is what's guiding what you're creating. So make sure that you properly fund and respect the contributions of, you know, your advisory committees and elders that you bring into your work.
And if I may, really, really quickly, Alika, you're right on. We do have a Indigenous community advisory committees, and we paid for boosters and we paid for the iPads, and they kept them all. You know, we didn't take them back. So you put it in your budget so that they can keep them, and buy boosters, as you know, and just, you know, keep the boosters as much as you can, and you know, make sure that they have everything that they need, and you don't you know, don't oversell it. Like, you know, give them what, you know, if you say you're going to do it, you do it, and don't you know, make sure that you don't you know, disappoint them, right? That's the worst thing you could ever possibly do. So I always put over budget so that, you know, if you need more iPads or whatever, you need another booster. And I'm really learning about this stuff because I have to, but yeah, you know, I just wanted to add on to that, Alika, because everything you said is right on. But yeah, that helps a lot. And then, you know, they come up with all the ideas and we just get the money for them.
Oh, Alexandra, you're next. Except that I just, you know, we've heard a little about support. We've heard about remuneration. We've heard about infrastructure changes. Anything that you can add as well?
Well, I obviously agree with what both Alika and Carrie have said so far. I'm going to go back to my earlier comment, and that is concerning the advisory panel for the Pan-Canadian drug formulary. And I think that Kenneth took some very important steps in that. I know that Dr. Nadine Caron had served on an earlier panel. And so I really commend Kenneth for that. I think that incorporating Indigenous expertise people into more of its initiatives, and possibly even creating a separate advisory panel that could be working across the different initiatives might really go a far way.
Well, thank you all for those final thoughts. And maybe before we close, if I can ask Elder Harvey, if you would be so kind as to close the conversation also with a prayer.
Just before we close up, I'm just going to comment on Alika and Dr. King responses in terms of, finding Indigenous people to do the work. I think I've appreciated working with the Alexandra Malcolm and Alexandra King of all the stuff that we do. And I think when we're working with First Nations communities, you have to find somebody that can articulate the information properly, to understandable, to make it simplistic so they understand. Because sometimes we talk about people and we tend to forget, whether they understand or not. And I think of, my work experience of all the communities that I've worked with, I always try to find somebody with a different language, or even Cree people, to make things simplistic for people to understand what we're doing, what we're saying. And you get results better that way, that I find anyways. And some of the stuff that we've done with College of Medicine or Indigenous Health and Wellness, like I said, appreciating Dr. King's Malcolm Alexandra, finding somebody working in our communities to understand the things that we do, making simplistic. It works a lot easier that way for us to work with communities like we're working with people up north right now. And that's the gratifying thing is, talking to people, their language, and they understand. So we try to make things a little bit more simplistic. With that, I guess I thank everybody, and good discussion, good dialogue, and everything else. Hope see people again soon. And with that, I'll do our closing prayer. Thank you. I think the here of soon the Kagi can still tell me. Actually, from the Constitution. I want to the Taman and the Gosha Queen, but the Scatama. Now, something into Toya, and show Margaret Nagatim now, Monanto is Pastax and Eastern. I want the basin that Agitani. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Elder Harvey. Well, and that brings us to the end of today's special webinar. A big thank you to our guests, Elder Harvey Thunderchild, Dr. Carrie Bourassa, Dr. Alexandra King, and Dr. Alika LaFontaine for spending their time with us today. Thank you also to everyone who joined us today. Thank you for the questions and the answers. We tried to get to some, we couldn't get to all. Apologies for that in advance, but thank you for joining us for this special webinar. I ask that you reflect on how you can best honor our inaugural National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And as we have heard, how do we turn our aspiration into action? Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thanks. Take care.